All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's at the top of the hour. Again, welcome everyone to the Fire and Fire Surrogate Studies and SageSTEP, the benefits of long-term fire research webinar. Thank you so much for joining. Today, we are going to hear from researchers who will discuss key findings at 4 Fire and Fire Surrogate Study sites, as well as from SageSTEP. My name is Lindsay Hosier, and I am the coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. And I do have a few housekeeping items to go over before I hand it over to Molly Hunter with the Joint Fire Science Program. Participants will be muted and video will be turned off during today's webinar. However, the chat box is open. We do encourage active participation in the chat box. We simply ask that chat messages stay on point and be respectful and inclusive of differing opinions. At the end of the webinar, we do have time to answer questions from the chat as well as questions provided during registration. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting the recording on the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists YouTube channel, as well as the other Fire Science Exchange websites. Closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. You can access this by clicking the CC, and that will engage the live captioning. And lastly, I just want to recognize all of the Fire Science Exchange networks that were on the planning team for this webinar. Without all of their efforts, we would not be able to put on this webinar. And with that, I will pass it over to Molly Hunter with the Joint Fire Science Program.
Oops, okay. Give me a second to share my screen. That look okay?
It's still loading. There, we've got it.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction. My name's Molly Hunter. I'm the science advisor for the Joint Fire Science Program. And I'm kicking off the webinar today just by giving you all a little background on the Joint Fire Science Program and the Fire Science Exchange Network. And then I will introduce the topic and the speakers that you'll hear from today. So Joint Fire Science Program, the original funders of the projects that you'll hear from today, it was established in 1998 by Congress as a joint partnership between Department of Interior and the USDA Forest Service. Our mission is to respond to the emerging science needs of managers, practitioners, and policymakers who are working in the field of wildland fire. So we provide funding for science and science exchange that's related to wildland fire, fuels management, and fire impacted ecosystems. And starting in 2009, we really upped our game in terms of the amount of investment we put into science exchange by establishing the Fire Science Exchange Network. This is a now 15-member regional network of exchanges that operate, within the regions, but also, as you can see in the webinar today, also collaborate a great deal on cross-cutting issues. So their mission is to share information and build relationships between managers and practitioners so that science exchange happens and the information is trusted. They also highlight research that's really applicable to their particular regions. They translate science in a number of different formats, including fact sheets, webinars, videos, training materials, all kinds of media. They demonstrate how research can be utilized on the ground. They also identify new research needs and provide that information back to us. And ultimately, all of these efforts we hope kind of support adaptive management in the field of wildland fire. And in the program, we really see this network not only as just a network that we support financially, but also is really key to our program and our ability to meet our mission. So we operate sort of on this cycle where we hear of new management challenges related to wildland fire. We then devise research questions to help address some of those challenges and solicit proposals to address those research questions. That we then fund that science, and when the science is done, we rely on the Fire Science Exchange Network to disseminate that information to the field so that hopefully it gets utilized in management decisions. So a couple key areas of the cycle of the Fire Science Exchange Network is really critical for us. They help us be informed of management challenges that are that practitioners, managers are facing within their regions. And that helps us craft our funding calls to meet practitioner needs. And then they, of course, disseminate that science when it's completed. So I encourage all of you to sign up for newsletters from these Fire Science Exchange networks if you haven't already. They do incredible work, and we're grateful for all the work that they do for our program. Now, onto the topic of the day, the Fire and Fire Surrogate studies and SageSTEP, the benefits of long-term research. These are two programs that were initiated by the Joint Fire Science Program. The Fire and Fire Surrogate studies was one of the first projects that JFSP supported back in 1998, and that was followed a few years later by the SageSTEP project, which had similar overall goals, but were sort of focused on different ecosystems. So the goal of these studies was to quantify the cost, ecological consequences of fire, mechanical, and other treatments in a variety of ecosystem types. So if you think back to 1998, this is a time when I think there was a lot more uncertainty about the effectiveness of field treatments and the ecological impacts of those treatments, and managers really needed information on, appropriate prescriptions to meet different objectives for a lot of different ecosystem types. So these projects were designed to reduce some of that uncertainty, to provide information for managers. So they were designed as replicated experimental treatments, all had a very consistent design, and those treatments were conducted at appropriate scales, large scales, so that they could really inform ecological processes that occur at the appropriate scale, and really could inform management practices. And they all had really consistent measurements before and after treatment, so that we could make really large scale inferences about field treatments. JFSP provided the initial funding, so the first 5 years, to establish the projects and to do the initial data collection. And then over time, we also provided some supplemental funding for things like data management and outreach activities. But the vision here was not to really support long-term research by funding measurements at these sites into perpetuity, but really to set a foundation, with a solid experimental design, solid plan for data management, so that it could people could return to it as long-term study sites. Collectively, these projects have been wildly successful. Resulted in over 250 scientific publications, numerous syntheses, field guides, all kinds of outreach activities, and have really, I think, led the way in terms of setting the foundation for our knowledge on field treatments, effectiveness, and impacts. Just a little more detail on each of these. So the Fire and Fire Surrogate study, again, started in 1998 at 13 different sites across the country. Each had these replicated treatments, a control, prescribed fire, mechanical treatments, and then a combination treatment. And all kinds of measurements taken before and after the treatments. So related to vegetation, fuels, soils, wildlife, entomology, and also treatment costs and utilization. And then this was followed in 2006 by the SageSTEP project, Sagebrush STEP Treatment Evaluation Project. Similar idea and design, treatments replicated at large scales that included a control, prescribed fire, a lot of different kinds of mechanical treatments, and also herbicides, since this was, control of invasive species is an issue in this region. And again, lots of measurements taken before and after those treatments. So today you're going to hear from researchers who indeed have been successful at maintaining these sites as long-term research. So these are the sites where measurements have kept going, and also in some cases there have been additional treatments since the initial experiment. So first you'll hear from Don Hagen with Clemson University talking
Hey,
about
Molly.
Yep.
While you're at time.
Okay. Then I'll guess I could just pass it on to Dawn, and then you could introduce. All I was going to do is introduce the other speakers, but we could just kind of snowball that, I guess, as we go. That sounds good. And I'm sorry, I can stop
Right.
sharing.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Can everybody see my screen okay?
We can see it, Don.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Don Hagan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University in South Carolina. And I'll be speaking today on behalf of a long list of collaborators about the Southern Appalachian Fire and Fire Surrogate Study Site that's in Western North Carolina at a place called Green River Game Lands. So the original objectives of the Southern Appalachian Fire and Fire Surrogate site, there were several of them, several objectives. The first one would be the restoration of an open woodland condition, right? So basically trying to um, uh, reverse the effects of a long period of fire exclusion and subsequent mesification that has happened in these forests, right? These forests that look a lot like that picture on the right. Oak regeneration, right, which oftentimes fails in the absence of fire. And then the associated benefits to native plants and wildlife, particularly those species that benefit from a more open overstory type structure. And then fuel reduction, of course. This is just a brief summary of some data collection activities at the Southern Appalachian site. As you can see, we've since 2001, a lot of different types of data have been collected from fuels, vegetation, soils, wildlife, you name it. But the main thing I want to focus on is that second column to the left, which is our treatment history, right? So at the Southern Appalachian site, we have had 5 prescribed fires since 2001, most recently in 2024. We've had 2 mechanical treatments in 2002 and in 2012. And I do want to stress that our mechanical treatments at this site are a little different from the treatments that you'll hear at the other fire and fire surrogate study sites. This was not a traditional like overstory thinning. This was just chainsaw felling of small stems, like under 10 centimeters, and also the chainsaw felling of this dense shrubby mid-story layer that is prevalent across the site. Another interesting thing about the Southern Appalachian site is that it did take a direct impact from Hurricane Helene in fall of 2024. And also, almost the entire site burned in a wildfire in 2025. And I think that's one of the neat things about these long-term sites is not only can we look at the effects of these repeated treatments, we can also look over time with these really nice longitudinal data sets at how those treatment effects are interacting with these subsequent disturbance events. And so we'll talk about that a little bit here. So most of the change that we're hoping to bring about at the Southern Appalachian site, most of the change is predicated on our ability to restore an open woodland. So I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by a woodland. So woodland is an overstory structural condition that we might say is less dense than a forest, but denser than a savanna. You know, maybe somewhere between 30 and 70% stocking, right? So in a case like this, your overstory trees are not monopolizing all the resources. You might have some gaps in the canopy where sunlight shines down to the forest floor, which results in a lush herbaceous understory and also promotes the regeneration of some of the desirable tree species. One of the ways that we can visualize what a woodland looks like is with a stocking chart. And so I've got a stocking chart here on the right. And that woodland zone where we're trying to shoot for is basically that green band right there across the middle between 30 and 70% stocking. And so what I'd like to do on these next few slides is kind of click through and I'm going to show you each of our 4 treatments and we'll see how they migrate over time relative to that green zone, right? So these are our pre-treatment numbers from 2001. Each of those 4 points represents the average of 30 plots, so a total of 120 plots. And as you can see in those pre-treatment data, we're by and large, we're pretty tightly clustered together and for the most part, not a woodland. We're not overstocked, we're not fully stocked, but we're for the most part out of the woodland zone for those 4 treatments. Let's keep an eye on those 4 dots, though. I'm going to click to the next image. Just watch those 4 dots, and we're going to see how they migrate. This is 2024, right? So this is after 5 prescribed fires and 2 mechanical treatments. We see that these points have diverged, right? And now that combo treatment, right? Mechanical treatment plus 5 prescribed fires is solidly, at least on average, right, in that woodland zone. Our control and our mechanical only treatment just got denser and now is approaching fully stocked, if not overstocked. And our fire treatment just kind of stayed in the same spot, right? Repeated burning didn't turn it into a woodland. It just kind of held it right about where it was, which is kind of interesting. That's 2024. We'll fast forward to 2025 after Hurricane Helene. I'm going to click back to 2024 just so you can follow the points. Watch those points. All of them shifted downward, right? We had fairly uniform canopy loss, just scattered individual trees, sometimes in groups, right? Moving those points downward, right? And now that fire treatment, while fire alone, repeated 5 times, didn't make it into a woodland, that hurricane nudged it maybe a little bit closer, right? So it kind of gets to that sort of interactive effects of our fire and fire surrogate treatments and then these subsequent disturbances. Oak regeneration is one of our goals, and oak regeneration, as we'll see here, is largely a function of basal area reduction. So in this figure, that x-axis is our change in basal area from pre-treatment to present, and then that y-axis is regeneration density. And here we're focusing on 2 groups of species. We've got the Quercus genus, which is our oaks. That's what we want to see. We want to see more oak regeneration. And then we've got the Acer genus, which is our maples. That's one of our primary mesophytic competitors. And we can see here that when basal area stays the same or increases, as it did in our control treatment, our mechanical treatment, and in some of our burn plots within that treatment, oak regeneration tends to get outpaced by maple regeneration. Right. However, when basal area is reduced, like it was in some of our burn plots and on average in our mechanical plus burn treatment, we see that flips and oak regeneration outpaces the maple regeneration. Duff is one of the big fuels that we're concerned with, duff being the organic horizon. And we saw that duff depth didn't change very much in the control and mechanical treatments over time, but it did decrease fairly substantially in the other treatments. Those 2 treatments that involve fire were successful at reducing duff depth, and we're going to circle back to that. And the herbaceous response was remarkable, especially in those plots, in those treatments where we opened up the canopy and or reduced duff depth. We saw a remarkable increase in our herbaceous understory vegetation, particularly those light-demanding grasses and sedges and broadleaf forbs. These species were mostly absent pre-treatment. They're mostly still absent in our control and mechanical only plots, but they've really exploded in those burn and mechanical plus burn plot. So that's a good sign. But the flip side is those same factors that are promoting the establishment of that native understory, that herbaceous understory, they also appear to be promoting a plant invasion, right? So these arrows point to a problematic invasive grass called miscanthus or Chinese silvergrass. And this species was not present in any plots in 2001, and it's only present in 1 plot now. However, it's present across the treatment areas. You see it when you walk from 1 plot to the next, and it appears that we're at the early stages of invasion in some of these places where we've opened the canopy and reduced the duff. And we see that here. This is some preliminary data, but it is largely a function of canopy openness, and especially in places where those canopy openings were created by fire. That seems to increase our miscanthus invasion risk, and so that's something that we're keeping an eye on. I mentioned that we had a wildfire in 2025. We're still working through the data on that, but I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. One of the neat things about these fire and fire surrogate study sites is that our treatment units are right next to each other in many cases. And so you can see, in our case, the effects of this wildfire and how it behaved differently in one treatment versus the other. I've got a control treatment on the left and then the mechanical plus fire treatment on the right. That fire behavior in that control treatment was extreme. We had smoldering combustion in the duff and in those heavy fuels, really long flame lengths, a very uh, intense fire. Whereas in that mechanical plus fire treatment, due to the fuel reduction and the patchy nature of those fuels that remained, the fire behavior was much less extreme. Right. So we'll have some data to share on that in the future, but this is what we have for now.
Sorry, Don, we are at time.
Okay, well, this is what lies ahead. Still an active project. We got a lot of papers in the works. Thank you for your time, and I will pass it on to Bryce.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Bryce Adams. I'm a research forester with the Northern Research Station, and I'm going to be representing the Ohio Hills site here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our 20-year results paper, Sustaining Eastern Oak Forests, the Synergistic Effects of Fire and Topography on Vegetation and Fuels, here with you today. And I just want to acknowledge the long list of co-authors and scientists that have worked on this paper here. Okay. So Ohio Hills was established in 2000. We have a mechanical and a fire treatment plus a combo mechanical and fire treatment. The mechanical treatments were established in 2001. The prescription for these treatments were to reduce the basal area by about 1/3. Using a thinning from below approach with a target basal area of about 80 to 85 square foot per acre. Okay. And then for the fire treatments, we conducted 4 prescribed fires beginning in 2001 following the initial mechanical treatments, and then roughly every 5 years after that. And one of the key objectives that we had in this study was addressing this mesification concern, whereas our overstories, which are largely dominated by oaks, in this case, about 80% of stems in the overstory are oaks. Oaks make up a very small percentage of the sapling or mid-story layer, which is largely the result of mesophytic competition from a number of species, in particularly red maple, which makes up about 1/3 of the stems in that sapling layer. So reversing these trends was a key objective of this site. The fire histories have been examined for these sites using dendrochronology. These stands were probably established in the mid-1800s. At that time, oaks were the predominant species that were being established into the overstory. In particular, for this site here, the mean fire return interval was for this period of time was about every 9 years. And then modern fire suppression occurred in 1923. And then after this, the only trees, in this case for the sample here for this site, that were established in the overstory were maples. So reducing this trend was a key objective for this site.
Bryce, sorry to interrupt you, but there's a little app, Zoom is sharing your screen at the bottom and it's blocking some of your data. Can you press?
Oh, I see. Gotcha.
Thank you.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've looked at the effects of the treatments on a number of structural and successional pathways, but one of the key analyses that we wanted to do for this 20-year results paper was looking at how the long-term moisture energy gradient interacts with the treatments when we use the integrated moisture index model. Okay, and so this is a spatial layer in which ridge tops and southwestern hill slopes, which are more xeric, have lower ME values versus our northeast facing slopes, which have more higher values. As ME values are reduced as sites become drier, the effects of fire intensity would be greater. This would reduce the stand structure, improve oak hickory regeneration, reduce mesophytic competition, and increase herbaceous diversity and cover. And we use a number of different models, in this case, an interaction model, which was an interaction between treatment and ME as what we call the synergistic model, and a number of other models with just those treatment effects alone to compare against. So as expected, as ME increases, as moisture regimes do increase, we saw fire intensity declining, so fire intensity would be greater on those drier sites as indicated here. And then as far as stand structure, with the fire treatments did reduce stand structure, and a pattern emerged throughout the number of variables that we looked at in which the MEC only and the fire treatments, they kind of converged and become similar. So the MEC only kind of returned to pre-treatment values and was largely dissimilar from the, or largely similar to the control treatments. And then the fire treatments also converged and were similar in terms of stand structure and a number of other variables, which I'll share with you here. And this was despite the initial reduction of the mechanical thinnings in 2001 for those mechanical treatments. And we can visualize that change in the structure here using a Gingrich style stocking chart as well. So in terms of synergistic effects, the hypothesis was accurate in that, and so looking at the change, so this is looking at the change in stand density, tree basal area, another of variables from pre-treatment to year 21. And for example, in stand density, the greatest reductions in stand density were on the drier sites, particularly in those fire treatments. So the synergistic effects were supported for a number of variables that we examined. So if we look at regeneration, in this case, seedlings, by year 21, we did increase oak hickory seedlings, particularly in the fire treatments, while there was an initial increase in the MEC only. Again, those values largely returned to pre-treatment values and were similar to the control treatments. For mesophytes, interestingly, by year 21, we did see modest increases in a mesophytic competition in the fire treatments, which I'll mention here in a second. As far as saplings, we did not increase sapling density for oak hickory for the most part. This probably as a result as there hasn't been enough time for that seedling layer to recruit into the sapling layer, and also because of the repeated prescribed fires, it's probably resetting those trees. For the mesophytic species, which again are composed of like our red maple, sugar maple, American beech, yellow poplar, black gum, we did see a reduction in that sapling layer, particularly in the fire treatments. So why are we seeing some modest increases in our mesophytic regeneration, particularly in that seedling layer? Well, this is largely the result of red maple resprouting. So the figure on the right shows red maple at pre-burn, a sprout after the first fire, a sprout after the second fire. So what's probably happening here is our mid-story red maples and saplings are essentially becoming resprouting seedlings, particularly in those fire treatments. So in fact, at year 21, if we look at the two fire treatments, which includes the combo MEC fire and the fire only, stems that were 1 to 2 inches that were red maple, over 90% of those stems were resprouts. So far the fire treatments seem to be resetting that successional stage for those red maple species, which is kind of explaining those modest increases in mesophytic competitors. Interestingly, the treatment-only model was the best supported model for the changes in understory richness. In this case, the fire treatments, again, largely converged and were similar in terms of the number of species that were gained, in this case, on average, about 4 species per plot. The control and mechanical treatments did not really change in terms of the number of understory species. We did some community analyses with this. And similarly, the fire treatments had a very similar community. And in fact, 60 indicator species, in this case, many asteraceae and legumes, were their frequency of occurrence and abundance was greatest in those fire treatments, whereas the control mechanical treatments, again, largely converged and had similar understories by year 21. And there were only 5 indicator species of those treatments there. So if we look at synergistic effects, those interactions, in which case fire effects were greatest on drier sites, reducing stand density, but also increasing oak hickory regeneration. That model was supported for a number of the different variables that we looked at. In this case, the seedlings, saplings, a couple of the overstory variables. However, with the understory, herbaceous richness, woody richness, herbaceous cover, and woody cover. The treatment-only models were the best supported models for that. So kind of in summary here, the control, and again, the mechanical treatments were very similar at a number of variables at year 21. There was no change in oak regeneration or in the ground layer for the control. We experienced some gradual gap scale mesification here. In the mechanical treatment, there was minor increases in oak regeneration, no change in the ground layer, large increases in competitors, and in many cases, this was sort of mesification on jet fuel here for the mechanical treatment. And again, the fire treatments largely converge in the number of variables we looked at. Synergistic effects were supported, and that those fire treatments were definitely interacting with the long-term moisture regime. We did see a little bit of modest increases in the competitors. This was with the result of red maple becoming smaller seedlings. Distinct plant communities emerged, and we did see a partial reverse of mesification with fire treatments. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to the next speaker, Sharon Hood. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, can see my screen now?
You're good, Sharon. We can see it.
Thanks. All right. Well, I'm going to jump right into talking about the Lubrecht Fire Surrogate study. It's also called the Northern Rockies Fire Surrogate. This is in Western Montana at the University of Montana's Lubrecht Experimental Forest, largely in ponderosa Douglas fir dominated forest. That at the time of the treatment, it had been about 80 years since the last fire. As just like for the other sites, we have the 3 treatments and compared with a control where we have a thinning that's also called a mechanical or mech, depending on, you'll see both in the results, that occurred in 2001, and then a prescribed burn that occurred in the spring of 2002. And the goals of these treatments were to reduce the likelihood of high severity fire, such that 80% of the overstory trees would survive given 80th percentile weather conditions. And another big goal was to restore ponderosa pine forests and have these forests become more dominated by ponderosa pine. So those were the planned treatments, and I'll talk about those initial effects of the treatments, but kind of complicating the interpretation of the long-term results was the fact that we had a mountain pine beetle outbreak that really impacted the study. It was part of a large regional outbreak that really began in 2005 and lasted till about 2012. So I wanted to start with just some pictures showing what these stands look like. And if you first focus on that left column in 2005, this is a couple years after the treatments have occurred, but before the mountain pine beetle outbreak has started. And so you see there's a lot of differences among the 4 treatments. And then moving 20 years ahead, on the right column, these are the same photo points. So you can see how much the forest has changed in some of the treatments, not so much in the MEC plus fire, but the MEC treatment, those small trees that were left after the thinning really grew up and increased in that mid-story layer. And then the fire and control treatments, because of the mountain pine beetle outbreak caused mortality, a lot of snags have since fallen over and really increased, opened up the overstory, but also increased 1,000-hour fuels. And so this is the basal area in 2002, right after the thinning and prescribed fires have occurred. And just want to point out that about 50% of the basal area was harvested in the MEC and MEC plus fire treatments. And the prescribed burns really didn't cause much mortality. That's what you can see in those green bars. So we didn't get a lot of mortality in the prescribed burns. And then moving forward 20 years, this is showing, again, that added effect of the mountain pine beetle outbreak. So that salmon color that's longer term mortality, about 5 to 18 years post-treatment. That's all attributed to the outbreak. And so you can see that's highest in the control and the fire treatment. And then also you can really see the how much growth has occurred in the MEC and MEC plus fire treatment. So this is some basic summary of understory responses with native and exotic cover and richness. And the big take home here was that we didn't see a lot of treatment differences against the control for native cover or richness. Our treatments were really tracking the control. That is probably, again, because of the complications with the mountain pine beetle outbreak causing so much overstory mortality in the control and fire treatments. Where we see the biggest difference is that exotic cover and richness in the right column. And we saw a large increase in the first few years after the treatments and in non-native species. And then that quickly declined, but it's still slightly statistically higher than the control and burn only treatments, even though it is much lower than right after the treatments occurred. And then this is just the percent of ponderosa pine that was killed by the mountain pine beetle outbreak. And again, showing that a large mortality in the control and fire burn only units, where these box plots show that in the thicker bar is the median value. So about 50% of the overstory ponderosa pine were killed in the control. And 18% in the burn. A lot of variability, but much higher. It was 0 in the thin and burn treatments. So the big take-home message here that was kind of an unplanned result is that even though these treatments, they were designed to be to reduce the likelihood of high severity fire, they were also shown to be incredibly effective against a bark beetle outbreak. And we think this is largely because of the increase in growth and defense that occurred largely from thinning. So this is showing basal area increment over time from a tree ring study. And no surprise, you thin the forest and those residual trees start growing faster, which is what we see here in those green and pink lines. We also found this corresponding increase in resin ducts as the trees were growing faster. And these resin ducts, that's a picture of them in the wood in the upper right. They're important because that's where resin is made and stored, and how it's delivered to attack sites. So when beetles are starting to attack a tree, they can sever these ducts and resin or pitch starts oozing out, like you see in this picture on the lower right. And the number of resin ducts really increases the defense system of the trees and helps them to pitch out the beetles and increase resistance to the outbreak. Moving on to fire hazard and predicted tree mortality. This is the probability of torching in the 4 treatments in 2002, right after the treatments were implemented. And what we see is that the probability of torching was highest in the MEC only treatment. And that's because the activity fuels weren't treated here. It was just a thinning from below, and the activity fuels were left on site. 20 years later, the probability of torching is now much higher in the control and fire-only treatments compared to the MEC and MEC plus fire. And related to that, should a wildfire occur, the predicted probability of mortality right after the treatments would have, the predicted probability of mortality was highest in the MEC only treatment because of those activity fuels and related to higher likelihood of torching. And then say 20 years later, that's now highest in the control and fire only treatments. So what this means for above ground stable carbon. So we did some modeling of looking at carbon, but also stable carbon. So modeling a simulated wildfire and how much biomass is living after that wildfire. So if a wildfire were to occur in 2002, they expect that the stable carbon would have been highest in the control and fire only treatments. A lot of that's because the thinning already removed a lot of that carbon, and then with added any predicted mortality. And that those results kind of flip-flop 20 years post-treatment, where stable carbon is now predicted to be lowest in the control and fire-only treatment compared to the MEC and MEC plus fire. So unlike the previous two studies, we've only, at the 20-year results, only reported 1 year or one treatment. That's all that had been done in the first 20 years. We've since implemented a harvest in 2023 and followed with a mastication in the thin-only treatment to try to have more of a true fuel treatment in the thin only compared to the first treatment that occurred in 2001. And then we've had a second prescribed burn in spring of 2024. So we're just starting to collect data on those initial effects now. So just in closing, our big kind of take-home messages were that at Lubrecht and the Northern Rockies, these fuel treatments are shown to be resilient to both wildfire and mountain pine beetle. Another big take-home message was that it was really hard, like our burn-only treatment did not get us to our desired conditions. We're realizing that's going to take several fires probably, and just time, since with going so long without fire, we can't expect one fire to kind of revert us to those baseline conditions. And I'll just leave it there. And then next we have Scott Stevens. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Scott Stevens here. Happy to talk to you today about the Fire and Fire Surrogate study in the northern Sierra Nevada. So you see here the title of the presentation is the title of this ecological applications paper that we actually wrote as part of a series. We have a special feature in ecological applications of all the Fire Surrogate sites that you've already heard about. So I would encourage you maybe to check those out if you can. But that was a nice thing that we were able to do as a group to try to get the sense of what we've learned in 20 years. It's amazing it's been 20 years already. So we've got a mixed conifer forest in the northern Sierra Nevada. Some of you maybe know, but that's ponderosa pine, sugar pine, Douglas fir, white fir, incense cedar, and California black oak. Our site has been repeatedly harvested, just like I would argue most of our forests in the Sierra Nevada, except maybe a few places. National forests have been harvested a great deal. But this area also had really the removal of fire in the very, very late 1800s. So fire was basically turned off. So no real fire in this site for 100 years or so, roughly. All right. And we actually are going to talk today about 3 prescribed fires in this study over 20 years, and we've actually burned the site a 4th time. So it's had 4 fires now, but I'll just report on 3 of them. And it's had 2 mechanical treatments as part of that combination in 20 years is all. And this idea of restoration thinning, I just want to spend a moment on this. I get a lot of grief sometimes when I talk about mechanical treatments in Sierra Nevada. And a lot of people tell me, well, that's just a timber grab. That's somehow just exploitive. You're just trying to make money for somebody. And I just always say, we are using mechanical methods here, but we focus on what we want to leave: species, compositions, size classes. And if we don't have anything in excess of that, we can take it with a mechanical harvest. And that's exactly what we've done. So I think this really is a restoration focus. There's some differences we'll show you here in a moment about these treatments, but it's not to say that we're somehow causing great harm by doing mechanical treatments, which I get a lot of comments, a lot of times from different groups and also even legislative folks. I'm going to show you a few pictures here now. We're going to go through a sequence of pictures. This is our mechanical only pre-treatment 2001. You've got about 400 trees per acre, 30 tons of surface fuel on the ground, and the duff layer is about 40 tons. You can see repeated harvests in there, maybe some stumps, things of that nature. I want you to watch that California black oak on the upper right-hand side of the picture, because we're going to see that picture, and the oak's going to keep coming back. So we do our treatment. We did a crown thin, kind of a crown thin, trying to actually only have one tree intersecting dominant or co-dominant trees. So, and also after that, a thin from below, and then a mastication treatment. Here's a masticator, and none of the masticated fuel left to site. It's all on site. I wish we could have done a whole tree harvest. We didn't have a market for it at the time in the early 2000s, so our masticated materials all on site. So you take a look here. Here's a sequence right after the first mechanical treatment. There's that California black oak in the upper right. And when we look at the potential fire behavior here, like Sharon just talked about, there's no improvement. So essentially we go from potentially a crown fire system to a high intensity surface fire in this condition. We got the masticated fuels on the ground. We've also got the natural fuels that accumulated over all those time with no real improvement in fire hazards right after our mech only treatment. We're going forward now. So here we are 8 years. Take a measurement here. 75% of the masticated fuel bed had actually decomposed. Surprised me a lot. I thought it was going to take a lot longer. At this point, 8 years out, we're actually got a stand that can withstand pretty good wildfire, and about 75% of the overstory will actually survive. We find out that the carbon sequestration of this particular treatment is doing very well. Here's 13 years after the first treatment. We start to see some of that advanced regeneration come in. And this is kind of what it looks like today. This is after our second restoration, thinning, and mastication. Potential fire behavior is relatively low. It's not as good as the fire treatments, but it's a huge improvement over the controls, huge improvement. We still have really good survivorship under a wildfire simulated at pretty 90th percentile conditions. And the other thing you'll see about this in a moment is the economics. We actually had economic analysis, and we made money here in this stand. Let's switch over to fire only for a moment. So this is our initial condition. That's a big sugar pine there, dead center. I want you to watch that tree, please, as we go through the sequence. We only can see about 20 feet, 25 feet. We got a same surface fuel, the same forest density. All 12 experimental units were basically the same before we started. So what do? We go out and certainly do our prescribed fire. This is our first fire. Turns out we burned at night with no precipitation beforehand and got some pretty good fire effects. The second and third and fourth fires actually had to burn in the day because the discontinuity, the fuel bed, made it almost impossible to burn at night like our first fire. So here we see some torching of the understory and the ideas of trying to reduce density with the fire. And then I would just put a little plug in here for more general purposes. We really need a bigger workforce to be able to do this type of work out here in California, and I would say in the Western US. Here's post first prescribed fire. There's a big sugar pine you see, and you can't tell that tree's alive, but it is. But we did kill about 75% of the trees less than 12 inches DBH, and about 70% of the surface fuel was consumed by that first fire. And this is what it looked like right afterwards. Let's go forward a little bit. Here we are 7 years after that first fire. We're starting to get some shrubs back. Native ceanothus. We're starting to see some of those trees that we killed in the first fire come down. And what do? We burn it again. There's the same tree. So our second ignition in 2009, this is kind of what it looks like 8 years after the second ignition. So starting to see a little bit more discontinuity. We're starting to be able to look into that stand much better, starting to get an ability to reduce density and open up these systems a little bit and get an understory response. Here's our third ignition, the third ignition of the same plot area, and there's that same sugar pine. And this is kind of what it looked like after the 4 years after the third ignition. So really desirable in terms of reduction of surface fuels, reduction of ladder fuel, and the ability now to incorporate kind of wildfire and have a stand now that actually could really resist it. We actually got hit by the mosquito fire a couple years ago, which actually burned one of our controls. I won't tell you much about that. It also burned a little bit of one of our fire-only units, and that unit particularly resisted that fire very, very well. The control got creamed. So a little bit about the data in the paper. Here is just a change in basal area over time. You can see the harvest is the yellow, the growth is the purple. If you do a statistical analysis, we only find that the MEC plus fire and the controls are significantly different, but all of them are still growing, which is interesting. Even the control continues to grow, which in some ways is a little bit of a surprise because it's so dense, but we haven't quite got the culmination yet. So that's kind of what we look like in terms of our basal area. This is large tree recruitment. Of course, large trees are important for a lot of reasons, carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat. So these are trees above 30 inches DBH. So on the left side is the pre-treatment. On the right side is about 20 years later after those treatments that have been put in place a couple times or 3 times. The control continues to recruit large trees. You can see that in the top blue graph, where we had to the left, to the right, they're actually continue to recruit. The MEC, the purple, is also doing a pretty darn good job of recruiting large trees, which is amazing because we didn't have a diameter limit on this thinning at all. So we're continuing to actually increase large trees in the MEC. The fire one is kind of interesting. You can see there's a little bit of a tail off to the right. We're seeing some recruitment of fire-only larger trees, but we also see a little reduction maybe in some of the medium-sized classes. MEC plus fire is probably the one that actually has had the least amount of large tree recruitment because of some interactions with the fire and maybe some bark beetles. What about econ? So we did an analysis, and paper shows that, of course, our fire-only treatment was at a net cost to the landowner. The mechanical treatment actually did a darn good job of reducing potential fire behavior and effects and produced positive revenues that were relatively high. And the MEC plus fire was basically a wash, about the same amount of cost to do the burning and the same amount of revenue from the mechanical harvest. And that would really depend upon log prices, frankly, and also all those other things. All 3 active treatments, fire, MEC plus fire, all produce conditions much more resistant to wildfire. Hence, the title of the paper is Multiple Pathways for Success in the Sierra Nevada. I would say the fire treatments did better because they reduce surface fuels by burning, but the mechanical treatment alone also substantially better than the control. And the MEC plus fire treatment was the only treatment that really started to get us down to a relative stand density index that we think actually would be appropriate for stressors like climate change and future fires in the future. So the MEC plus fire was lower density outcome got us closer to a relative SDI, relative stand density index, what we think we would like to have into the future. Both the fire only and the MEC only treatments didn't quite get us there. The control basically is in the imminent mortality zone and is basically a nightmare. With that, I'll just thank a few folks. Man, we've had a lot of people, like all our folks have been working on these studies, and I never could have done this without them. And with that, I'll stop. And I'll actually pass it over to Lisa, who's going to talk about the SageSTEP project.
All right, thanks a bunch, Scott. I think Beth is getting our presentation loaded. Beth Newingham and I are going to co-give this presentation on the Sagebrush STEP treatment evaluation project. We call it SageSTEP. This is a project that, as Molly described, started just a little bit later than the FFT project, but follows a lot of the same types of research questions and a lot of the same treatments. This project, as Molly described, was funded initially by the Joint Fire Science Project, but has had a whole suite of funders and partners through the years. And I particularly want to thank the BLM, both BLM Fuels, BLM Range, and BLM Wildlife, who have been ongoing sources of support. All the icons pictured here represent ongoing partners in the project. It's a combination of university folks, as well as people across many federal agencies. Next slide. So why SageSTEP? Sagebrush ecosystems were not represented by the FFT project and are highly threatened. There's two major sources of threats right now. Cheatgrass, which is an invasive annual grass, is invading the ecosystem, and we have increases in pinyon and juniper into areas that were historically shrubland dominated. So these biological changes together have increased wildfire risk, and they've reduced values that we care about in these ecosystems, things like forage, water quality, wildlife habitat. Next. And it was very clear that land managers wanted more information on field treatment effectiveness, the response of these ecosystems to different options for treatments. One thing that's been really important, we have 20 sites across the Intermountain West, and there's been lots of variability both in space and in time in the 20 years since we started the project. And the effects of climate on ecosystems. So our sites span a broad climatic gradient. Next. So the vision for this project was to provide the infrastructure and a data resource to examine treatment effects in these sagebrush ecosystems. And on the screen here, there's a map of where all of our sites exist across a 6-state region. We divide the sites into two main networks. The icons that are in yellow are our shrubland plots. The icons that are in green are our woodland plots. And together there are 20 plots. Next. Things that we value and want to provide to the management and research communities are continued data collection on various ecosystem components that we'll talk about, to provide research on ecological change and to synthesize and communicate actionable science on options for management in these ecosystems. Next slide. So I'll tell you a little bit about the two different networks. The shrubland network, or the shrubland experiment, has 4 woody field treatments. So these were treatments that targeted the shrubs. At each of our sites, we did a prescribed fire where we targeted burning all of the shrubs to restore the herbaceous understory. We did a mow treatment, which reduced half of the shrub canopy, a tebuthyron, which is a herbicide that targets shrubs. Again, we wanted to remove about half of the canopy, and then we left untreated controls. Next. And then crossed with that, there are also, hey Beth, can you ping the next one? There are also herbaceous field treatments where we used imazapic, which is a herbicide that is a pre-emergent that targets the suppression of the invasive annual grasses. So each of those treatments are pictured there. And because we have so many sites that span a climatic gradient, we were able to test all of these treatments both at the warm and dry end of the region, up through the cool and moist end. And in in the sagebrush biome, there's not a lot of rain, so moisture is the major limiting factor, and even the difference between being on that low end, like 8 inches of precipitation a year, is a really big difference than the high end where you might have 12 or 14 inches of precipitation per year. Next slide. So the woodland experiment is areas where historically they would have been shrubland, but there's more and more conifers that are coming in, either woodland and or pinyon pine. And so in these areas where conifers are encroaching into shrublands, we did one of 3 treatments, either again prescribed fire, mechanical cut and drop treatment, and in Utah we did mastication treatments. At all sites there are also untreated controls. They also exist along like climatic gradient, and they also were done across 3 different phases at each site, where phase 1 means that shrubs still dominate the system, but there's some trees that are starting to encroach into the area. Phase 2, trees and shrubs are co-dominant, and phase 3 is where we've lost most of that understory, and the conifers are dominating ecological processes on site. Next slide. So some of the things that we've collected mirror what was done in the FFT. And I want to give a shout out to Jim McEver because he was actually the initial PI for both the FFT and of SageSTEP. So there's a lot of overlap in the way that these were set up. We also collected vegetation data, density, height, cover, community composition, gaps between perennial vegetation. We collected data on hydrology, runoff, erosion, and how that has interacted with plant communities. My group does a lot with fuels, structure and arrangement, fuel loading, looking at each different fuel strata. There are folks looking at soil carbon, biogeochemistry. We have climate stations at each site. And then folks have done various things with insects, with wildlife. And I think the next slide is just highlighting some of the types of products that we've put out. It's both scientific literature. We've had 2 special issues. One was in rangeland ecology and management. The next was in ecosphere. And then our data have been used in outside ecological studies. They've been used in several different modeling platforms and to create large-scale review papers describing the role of fire in these ecosystems. And I'm going to hand it off to Beth now, and she is going to talk about some of our specific findings through the first 15 to 20 years of the project.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so I'm going to quickly summarize the first 10 years of results that we have. And the first couple of years we're going to call the treatment implementation phase. And I'm going to break it out between shrubland and woodland. So for the shrubland sites, when we look at the woody fuel treatments that Lisa mentioned, it did substantially reduce our shrubs in both the burn and the mow treatments, but not in the tebuthyron treatment. There was initially no effect on the understory, including cheatgrass, forbs, and perennial grasses. For the herbaceous field treatment, again, which was imazapic to reduce cheatgrass, that indeed did reduce cheatgrass, but it also had somewhat of a negative effect on the perennial forbs and perennial grasses in those first couple of years. For the woodland treatments, we found that both burning and mechanical treatments reduced those trees. And for understory responses, we found that perennial grasses decreased in the first year, but they were able to recover after that. We saw a flush in perennial forbs, but we did have some trade-offs with non-natives increasing in years 2 and 3. So we have variable understory responses to that. Another thing that came out of the beginning of the experiment was the development of the resilience and resistance framework, where we found that those cool sites that Lisa was talking about were more resilient to disturbance than warm sites, and that invasion resistance really depended on whatever your pre-treatment herbaceous cover was. And because we have such a broad geographic gradient of these sites, we found, and this is still true, there's a lot of heterogeneity among those sites, and whatever your site conditions really dictates what you start with and what you end up with. For years 6 to 10, we kind of call these the early response years. So for shrublands, just talking about vegetation, again, we saw an initial decrease in cheatgrass with the imazapic application, but overall cheatgrass is increasing across our sites regardless of treatment. Sagebrush recovery has been slow to non-existent, which we know is not very resilient to some of these disturbances, and that's true even with fuel treatments. When we modeled fire behavior using our fuels data, we found that mechanical and prescribed fire reduced modeled fire intensity, which was a management objective. So for the woodland sites, we have a little bit more nuance here. So for the vegetation responses, treatments were less severe in our cool and moist sites than warm and dry sites. And the mechanical treatment was less severe than the prescribed fire. And what I mean by that is in the prescribed fire, you had a higher risk of getting more annual grasses and not having your sagebrush come back. But the goal of increasing your herbaceous vegetation was achieved with these treatments. However, there was a trade-off with that because you have that increase in herbaceous fuels, it increased our modeled surface fire intensity, but there was a decrease in canopy spread, but that was only happening in the phase 3 woodlands. So those were the first 10 years. Now we're in the latter half, so years 10 to 20. We're working on the 15-year data, and we're also at the 20-year point. We're just beginning to collect the 20-year data this year. And so now we can ask questions about treatment longevity. Maybe when should you go back into a site and retreat these areas? And we've been continuing to collect the long-term data, including vegetation, fuels, climate, and soil moisture. We also are looking back at some historical data for our insects and our birds. And over 20 years, you get new opportunities. So there's new technology where we're now monitoring bird populations using bioacoustics. Our sites have been fenced for 20 years, or some of them have. And so last year we started an effort looking at responses both inside and outside of those exclosures. And as other sites have in the FFS have also experienced fire, we have experienced fire. 40% of our sites have burned in the last 12 years. So it did provide us with an opportunity to look at a dual disturbance of a fuel treatment and then a wildfire. So SageSTEP really is an unprecedented data set. It's the largest replicated and longest running fuel treatment experiment in Sagebrush. And that's really important because these systems do span wide environmental gradients and site conditions. It's a slow growing ecosystem that we need that long-term data. We've been able to capture those native and invasive dynamics. We've quantified above ground and below ground carbon dynamics, and we've had the opportunity to look at ecosystem responses after wildfire. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge this project was co-produced with federal and state agencies that really were involved all the way through from our vision to our treatment implementation and developing our products. And having that management input was really important to make sure that our research was aligning with management priorities, and our products have been created with manager input and further use in making management decisions. So with that, I will pass it to Lex.
Thank you. Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about the overarching lessons that we've learned from the long-term field treatment studies that we've been talking about today, more so focusing, sorry, on the insights from the studies, including our understanding of what worked, what didn't, and how we should adapt these field treatments going forward. As we've seen today, the main objective of these field treatments is to reduce fire hazard. So these treatments are often designed to restore vegetation structure because those are the types of conditions that we know were resilient to a particular fire regime. However, ecosystems are highly dynamic, as we know, and so they're constantly changing over time in response to endogenous conditions like vegetation succession, as well as exogenous conditions such as the things that have been talked about today, like drought, wildfire, insect outbreaks, and hurricanes. And that's what makes these long-term studies so valuable, is that they give us this really cool opportunity to monitor the substantial changes that have occurred in the years following these field treatments. And all that monitoring then allows us to ask a really important question, which is how have these different field treatments across these different ecosystems changed over time, and how should we adapt our management strategies given what we know now? And so just a brief review of the different studies that we've talked about today. These studies include multiple long-term research sites across the western and eastern parts of the United States, including Blodgett and Lubrecht, which are coniferous forests out in the west, Ohio Hills and Green River, which are hardwood forests out in the east, and then of course what was just mentioned in the previous presentation, the Sagebrush Steppe, which is out in the Great Basin. And we've talked about all the different field treatments that they've implemented across these different studies. But again, they've included a control, mechanical thinning or cutting, prescribed fire, a combination of mastication, herbicide, mowing, etc. And so after monitoring these sites over many years, what have we really learned? Well, what some of the biggest sort of lessons that we've learned is that mechanical treatments are really good at restoring patterns, but not necessarily processes, meaning that mechanical treatments are really good at having a more immediate effect on vegetation, structure, and composition, things like reducing tree density, increasing tree size, favoring desired overstory species, but they don't necessarily fully replicate the ecological processes like fire does. Whereas conversely, prescribed fire restores processes, but not necessarily patterns, meaning that it can stimulate understory vegetation, as we've seen, understory diversity, and create conditions that are more favorable to regenerating and recruiting desired species into the overstory. However, overstory structure and composition is more difficult to change when we're using just fire alone. And that its benefits only really persist when you're able to use fire repeatedly. And so what we found was that the general consensus across these different sites, as you've seen today, is that really it's a combination of mechanical treatments plus fire that seems to achieve, albeit not all objectives, but many of the objectives that we have. And so even able to achieve those objectives in the long term. But even this strategy, this combination strategy, has its trade-offs for sure. Some of them have been talked about today, right? So like some of the fuels that are created by fire, you can generate fuels that can accumulate over time. We also have to keep in mind that that kind of a treatment also, while it does create favorable conditions for the desired vegetation that we want, it's also creating favorable conditions for the vegetation that we don't want to promote. So things like shrubs, invasive species, which has been shown in a lot of the presentations today, less fire resilient species, and these things can proliferate even after this type of treatment. And so I think that this leads to more, or one of the most important lessons that we've learned, which is that we have to really invest in monitoring, evaluating, and implementing maintenance treatments that are adjusted based on new objectives, but also the new conditions that are being created over time. And then so given what we've learned over the last couple of decades from monitoring these field treatments, is that we can modify, or we're asking ourselves, well, how can we modify the original fields treatments given what we know now? And so I think in general, what we find is that we would increase what we remove via mechanical treatments to reduce competition, to reduce or be more selective in how we reduce these non-desirable species or less fire resilient species in the overstory, especially to increase spatial heterogeneity and complexity, and to increase light availability to promote some of the understory species that we're trying to promote. We would also maybe consider increasing the intensity of prescribed fire should these conditions allow us to again, in the combination treatment, sort of add to the complexity or enhance the complexity and openness achieved when we're also adding that mechanical treatment. We would also consider adjusting the frequency of these treatments to ensure that we're maintaining desired conditions. I think that's been pretty obvious given the presentations that we've seen today. Or possibly add other tools to the toolbox if we can't necessarily adjust the frequency of the current strategies that we're using. And so something that's been talked about at some of the other sites is like, okay, well, maybe even using something like herbicide, right, to mitigate some of these shrubs or invasives or competing vegetation, should we not be able to conduct prescribed fire at a desired frequency. And I think more importantly, what we've learned is that any adjustment that we make to these prescriptions should be considered within the context of these site-specific conditions. So because we know that these site-specific conditions can change substantially over time, whether we're talking about climate, productivity, even the types of species that are at these sites, and what their specific adaptations are to the actual types of treatments that we're doing. So it's important to remember that any effective management strategy is going to be an iterative process. Objectives are going to change over time, but we have to recognize that achieving those objectives are really constrained by the site-specific conditions that we have, which we know can also change over time. And then so in summary, we can use what we've learned from these invaluable studies to guide us in developing prescriptions that are more effective. And I think the key takeaway here is that treatments, at least what we found across these studies, is that they can still have lasting effects even 15 to 20 years after these field treatments have been implemented, but especially when they've included repeated maintenance treatments. And so if we want successful long-term outcomes, then we have to consider, okay, well, what roles do these treatment types serve in the particular ecosystems that we're working in? So when we think about, again, in general, the MEC plus fire seem to give us what we would call, quote unquote, like the best results, but mechanical seems to be more aligned in maybe the coniferous forests out in the west, where fire seems to be a little bit more effective in the hardwood forest out in the east, or what was mentioned in the previous presentation. It sort of depends whether or not you're working in shrubland versus woodland ecosystems. The type of strategy that you want may actually vary. And so you have to think about the ecosystem that you're working with. How often would those treatments need to be applied? And would the outcomes of such treatments align with future conditions? Because as we've seen, and again, the value of these long-term studies is that they're going to be interacting with these disturbances that we may not have necessarily anticipated when these initial treatments were designed. And so we know the outcomes from those treatments are really going to then be constrained, are really going to constrain what we can actually work with when we're trying to accommodate new objectives under new conditions in the future. And then so with that, I think we're going to open it up for a Q&A session. Given the time that we have. And so.
And speakers, if you wouldn't mind turning your cameras back on. Thanks, Dawn.
And so I think thanks to everyone who submitted questions when you registered for the workshop, because there's some really good ones in here that I think align with some of the things I haven't talked about in this presentation. And so one of the ones that stood out to me, and I think it's been talked about a little bit in the actual chat, with regards to the frequency of prescribed burning. And so for the sites that have conducted multiple prescribed burns, if anybody wants to speak to what an ideal sort of burn schedule would look like in these long fire excluded habitats. And so the concern that the person had put in this question was really burning too frequently, which I know can be a problem. I know maybe we've seen a little of this at Blodgett in terms of actually eventually not having enough fuels to carry the fire to keep up a pretty frequent fire regime. But would anybody like to speak to maybe an ideal burn frequency that they would recommend for their particular system?
I can start, everybody, and then maybe some folks from the East could jump in. It's a very good question. When you have research, you're trying to, do activities and measure response, right? So one thing I would say at Blodgett, we probably have burned a little more frequently than we probably would if we were just looking for a management kind of a scenario. I think you could burn a Blodgett probably after the first two. I mean, the first one, of course, that's the reset. Number two, at least in Blodgett, was consuming the large amount of dead and down that you created, number one. So those two, I think, have to happen actually quite quickly, probably within 5 to 7 years of each other. Then after that, I think you got more time that you could actually allow the system to take and then burn it maybe a little longer frequency. At Blodgett, our research dendrochronology, 7 to 15 years. 7 to 15 years return interval, all right? We're burning on the sevens. So we've been burning probably on the shorter end of the system. And as Lex alluded to, and I mentioned, we're not getting as high amount of spread. One thing is really interesting, I think, is in the third fire we did, we only got about 65% or 60% of the ground even to have any fire at all in the fire only units because there was so much discontinuity. In some ways, that's probably exactly what a fire regime should have, right? You should have this discontinuity and not burning everywhere. So, but I would say, at least in my experience now, that I think mimicking a little bit more the fire interval of the dendrochronology 7 to 15 versus us been burning more frequently than that. And I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if anybody else would like to chime in, please.
I can speak to the east, or at least the Green River side, a little bit. We're sort of viewing our fire regime here at Green River as two phases, right? So this initial phase, which I think we're still in, is really the restoration phase, and we're trying to put fire on the ground as often as we can, as often as it will, carry fire. To help control some of this competing vegetation, to create that desired forest structure. And then once we get there, and we're getting there, but once we get there, the thinking is that we can back off to more of a maintenance phase, which will probably be more similar to like the historic fire return interval, right? So we started out at Green River at a 3-year fire return interval. We haven't always been able to maintain that, but realistically, the long-term fire interval should probably be something like 6 to 8 years. And so hopefully in the future, we'll be able to back off to something like that.
I would say that we are at the polar opposite end, where in the sagebrush, we're unlikely to do any more prescribed burns ever. In the woodland network, we do have places where we've got a lot of little juniper coming back in, but the risk in these systems outweighs the benefits of a prescribed fire treatment for the most part. We're likely to get invasive annual grasses in some of these areas, so we would be more inclined to choose other treatments for retreatment.
Okay, great. If anybody else doesn't have anything to add, maybe moving on to the next question. Sharon gave a really good talk at AFI, more so on like the logistics of like actually like more of like the nuts and bolts of like monitoring or creating an appropriate like long-term study design given like what we've learned about the monitoring that we've done, at least in the Fire and Fire Surrogate studies. And so there were a couple of questions that people had submitted talking about any sort of advice or reflections on starting a long-term monitoring project, and also if how would you also like given that in these long-term studies, there is the potential, as we've seen, for like interacting with disturbances that you don't necessarily anticipate, how you would incorporate that into the actual study design. I don't know, Sharon, if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure, I could get us started. I feel like the biggest things is really it's almost impossible to document enough. Like, so just to really try to develop a structure where you are going to be able to archive all the information about from your treatment goals and then but the actual treatment implementation, all the kind of supporting documents plus your data, because these sites are big. There's a lot of people involved, so developing a system to be able to share data and for people and a repository for people to be able to access different parts of the data for analysis, and over time to accommodate for personnel changes, graduate students come and go. So there can be a lot of turnover, retirements. And so having a system that's where people can go and access that information and it's not lost is really important on the data side of things, but also the on-site monumentation part is something that was a big lesson learned for us about, how you act, like the actual equipment you use to monument your plots that can last, for decades, withstand fire, all these different, just to be out there to where you can go and relocate the plots has been a big lesson learned for us, like what tree tags work the best, and kind of and maintaining that takes a lot of effort. So it's like, as researchers, I tend to think about how much time it's going to take just to remeasure the plots, and I forget about how much time it takes to just kind of maintain the plots, resetting the tags, like fixing any stakes, things get buried and chewed on and all kinds of stuff. So I feel like those were my kind of two biggest things that came to mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Don, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just I agree with all of that. And the other thing that I would add would be to think beyond the plots themselves. And what I mean by that is just that example I gave with miscanthus, this invasive grass that's showing up in our plots. I think it's only in one of our plots. And so if we were just looking at the data, we wouldn't realize that we're in the early stages of a miscanthus invasion, right? And it's really easy or tempting, when you're out there collecting data, you go do plot one, then you walk to plot two, and you go collect those data. But I think paying attention to not just the plots, but what you're seeing around the plots is really, really important, because once we started paying attention, we realized we had a lot more miscanthus than we thought we had. And had we waited till it started to show up in a lot of plots, it probably would have been too late.
Hey, Lex, I was just going to add maybe a small thing too. One thing I would say is, how do you recruit future PIs for these sites? I mean, these sites have turned over a lot. I'm not sure, but I'm one of the few probably original PIs that are actually part of the surrogate study. I don't know if that's exclusive, but I am actually actively thinking about this. How do I actively recruit the next generation of people to keep this going? Because the investment of all of us that you've heard today in these sites is profound. I can't imagine doing this again, so I don't know. So I think trying to invest in that turnover, also finding funding to continue these things to go. JFS has been a key piece to this, of course, but all of us have looked for other sources, so I do think there's incredible ability to learn more from these things, and you've heard about that today. So somehow these got to get funded. I don't know if JFS has another call on this someday or something, who knows? But I think there's got to be a way to fund it. Otherwise, we're in trouble. And the last thing is data archiving. I've been around this stuff. I mean, my students are a lot smarter than me. And we've tried to archive our data, and doing this for this long a period has been hard. And, and now there's some things, there's one package we're really fortunate, Berkeley Forest Analytics. John Battles, actually professor in our department in UC Berkeley, has created an R package that actually will do analysis. It'll also do data checking. It'll also help you archive your data. So we're completely blessed to use that system now, but somehow all of us have got to figure out a way to archive this in a robust way. I've got about 23 versions of my damn data. So which one is the recent one? Which one is the least modified? John has figured out a way to do that much more deliberately than I ever have. So I just wonder about that as another comment.
So I'll comment from the SageSTEP side of things, and everything that everyone has said so far is also the challenges that we have had. I would like to give kudos to the original PIs on SageSTEP. So back in 2014, they actually did a big recruitment to find people to take over the project. So that's how Lisa and I got involved back then. And it was several years after that we actually became the leads on the project when Jim McKeever retired. So they really put a lot of effort into sort of finding out who are the right people to get back in the project. We have had a lot of issues also with data management. We have a data store for the entire project, but changes over time. Again, data stores age. And so we're trying to update those things. So that's been a big challenge, and just making sure that we have consistent methods across sites and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of really good thought by those initial PIs and I don't even know how they did it as well as they did. But they set up the experiments really well. had that consistent data collection, but we still have issues. We're consistently trying to figure out how to deal with some of the data. Some parts of our data haven't been used. So again, if anybody's interested in using data, this is all publicly available. But it's a really big challenge, and piece is huge. We're getting at year 20, and it gets harder to sell things because some people don't value that 20 years while you're doing the same thing. But I think as we all have illustrated, these ecosystems change over those 20 years. And so having that long-term data where you started out, the middle point is different, and the end point, whatever that might be, could be totally different. So you have these different ecosystem trajectories, and we wouldn't know that without these long-term experiments.
Great, and I think we might be at time for the Q&A session.
Yeah, Lex, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining today. And I really want to give a big shout out to all the speakers. It was nice for you guys to share your knowledge and expertise. And I know I learned a lot, and I hope all the participants did as well. And I also wanted to give a shout out to all the exchanges for planning this awesome webinar. And then once everyone does close out of the webinar today, there will be an anonymous survey pop up on your screen. If you could just take a few minutes to fill that out, we would appreciate the feedback. And again, thank you, everyone.